Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, the Leper King. Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, also known as the Leper King, ascended the throne in 1174 and ruled the Kingdom of Jerusalem until his death in 1185. Diagnosed with leprosy in childhood, his entire life and reign were marked by the illness, constant struggles for power, and growing pressure from Muslim forces. Despite his disease, Baldwin successfully led several military campaigns against Saladin, including the famous Battle of Montgisard in 1177, where he achieved victory. Want to know more? Here is the story of the life of Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, the legendary king of the Crusades. Baldwin IV of Jerusalem was born in the middle of 1161 as the son of Amalric, Count of Jaffa and Ascalon, and his first wife, Agnes of Courtenay. Baldwin's godfather was his uncle, King Baldwin III of Jerusalem, who jokingly remarked at the baptism that he was giving his godson the Kingdom of Jerusalem as a gift. Since King Baldwin III was 20 years old at the time and had recently married, no one took the words seriously, as it was not expected that the boy would ever sit on the throne. Yet that very same year, Baldwin III died young and childless of dysentery, and Amalric became his heir. The High Court of Jerusalem, however, refused to accept Amalric's wife Agnes as queen, insisting that he repudiate her, reportedly out of fear of her influence and reputation. Amalric ultimately agreed to annul the marriage on grounds of consanguinity, clearing the way for him to become King of Jerusalem. Although the marriage was annulled, Amalric and Agnes's children, Sibylla and Baldwin, were declared legitimate. Baldwin grew up without his mother, since Agnes soon remarried, first to Hugh of Ibelin, brother of the more famous Baldwin of Ibelin, and later to Reginald of Sidon, only visiting her son occasionally. Baldwin rarely saw his sister Sibylla, who was raised by their grandaunt Ioveta, at the convent of St. Lazarus in Bethany, the wealthiest abbey in the kingdom. Baldwin's father, now King Amalric I of Jerusalem, married Maria Comnene, with whom Baldwin had little close relationship. The queen was ambitious and viewed him as an obstacle to the prospects of her own children. Since Baldwin was to be a future king, his father sent him at the age of 9 to live with William of Tyre, a sophisticated and widely travelled cleric renowned for his learning. William was not only a scholar, but also an important church dignitary and diplomat, under whose guidance Baldwin studied Latin, French and Arabic, common for noble youths, especially in Jerusalem's multicultural environment. It was William of Tyre who first noticed that Baldwin did not feel pain in his hand when other boys pinched and scratched him during play. Although Baldwin displayed no other obvious symptoms, physicians suspected leprosy. They hesitated to make the diagnosis, however, since the disease was highly stigmatized and incurable. If declared leprous, Baldwin, still a child, would by law have had to enter the Order of St. Lazarus, a Catholic military order founded by the Crusaders for lepers. Despite his condition, Baldwin showed remarkable perseverance and determination. He continued his education and prepared for his future duties as ruler. William of Tyre and other tutors taught him not only theoretical knowledge, but also practical skills necessary for governance and military leadership. Baldwin even learned to ride a horse using only his knees. When physicians informed Amalric that leprosy might indeed develop in his son, the king attempted to marry Sibylla to the French Count Stephen I of Sancerre, hoping their potential offspring could provide a new heir should Baldwin succumb to the illness. Yet in June 1174, King Amalric fell ill with dysentery and died on July 11th, leaving behind a minor heir and an unmarried daughter. After Amalric's death, the High Court of Jerusalem met to deliberate the succession. Although Baldwin had not yet been formally diagnosed with leprosy, the court was aware of the physician's suspicions. Still, Baldwin was the king's only son, for from his second marriage to Maria Comnene, Amalric had only daughters, and only Isabella survived childhood. Baldwin thus appeared the only viable option. Other male candidates included Amalric's cousins, Prince Bohemond III of Antioch, Baldwin of Antioch, and Raymond III, Count of Tripoli. None seemed suitable. Bohemond was bound to Antioch. Baldwin was in the service of Byzantine Emperor Manuel I Komnenos, and Raymond had spent 9 years in Muslim captivity, making him practically a stranger to the nobles of Jerusalem. After 3 days of deliberation, Baldwin was chosen as king, with the understanding that Sibylla would be married to a suitable man who could act as regent, and whose male heir could succeed in Baldwin's place if necessary. Baldwin was crowned King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem on July 15, 1174, in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, anointed by Patriarch Amalric of Nesle. Whereas medieval monarchs were usually crowned on Sundays, Baldwin's coronation occurred on a Monday, the 75th anniversary of the capture of Jerusalem during the First Crusade. As Baldwin IV was crowned at the age of 13, still below the age of majority in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which was 15, he required a regent to rule in his name. Initially, the office was held by Seneschal Miles of Plancy. In Jerusalem, there were 6 principal officers, and the Seneschal was one of them, the king's chief deputy with administrative and military authority and control over taxation. Miles's regency did not last long. Shortly afterward, Count Raymond III of Tripoli arrived in Jerusalem and, as the king's closest relative, assumed the regency. Miles was soon assassinated while attempting to expand his influence over the kingdom, and for 2 years, no new seneschal was appointed. During this time, the young King Baldwin, in the absence of his regent, presided over the High Court himself. When Baldwin became king, his mother Agnes returned to court. Although she had been absent from his life since his early childhood, she became his trusted advisor. Baldwin had no memory of her, having grown up without her since the age of 2. But as she treated him kindly, he formed a strong bond with her, even though historians later often accused her of exploiting the king's illness for her own enrichment. During the regency, King Baldwin's leprosy was officially diagnosed. It is unclear from whom he contracted the disease, but it must have been someone with whom he spent much time and who did not show obvious symptoms. Contrary to common practice, Baldwin was not separated from others, though it was assumed that he would never be able to marry or have children. Puberty accelerated the progression of the disease, and his condition deteriorated rapidly, affecting especially his limbs and face. Despite the popular image we all know from the excellent film Kingdom of Heaven, no surviving sources provide evidence that King Baldwin IV ever wore a mask. Not even one as elegant and stylized as the one worn by Edward Norton in the movie. William of Tyre, in his chronicle, wrote that Baldwin used a veil or hood to cover his face in public so as not to frighten or disgust his subjects. Another contemporary chronicler, Roger of Hoveden, likewise confirmed that he wore a veil. Some modern historians, however, point out that there is no physical evidence or documentation proving Baldwin wore either a mask or veil, particularly because the advanced stage of his leprosy would have made it difficult for him to wear anything on his face. According to some historians, Baldwin bore his scars with pride, and despite his illness, he displayed strength and confidence. He showed no shame for his disease, thereby affirming his trust and faith in God and demonstrating to others that he was not cursed. Count Raymond III of Tripoli made it his priority to find a husband for Baldwin's sister Sibylla, the presumed heiress. In 1176, William of Montferrat was chosen. He was the son of William V, Marquess of Montferrat in Piedmont, Italy, and cousin of both Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa and King Louis VII of France. William of Tyre described him as a tall, blonde, handsome man, brave, honest, and unpretentious, whose only vice was a fondness for food and drink. By virtue of the arranged marriage, William gained the county of Jaffa and Ascalon. However, Only a year later, while engaged in overseas campaigns, he fell ill, likely with malaria, and died, leaving Sibylla alone, pregnant with the future King Baldwin V. 2 years after his coronation, Baldwin reached the age of majority. With the end of Raymond's regency, at his mother's suggestion, the king appointed his loyal and capable maternal uncle, Cuillin of Courtenay, to the office of seneschal. During the regency, Raymond had signed a treaty with Saladin to ensure Jerusalem's neutrality in conflicts between him and the successors of Nur ad-Din, which in turn facilitated Saladin's unification of Egypt and much of Syria under his rule. Baldwin, however, refused to ratify Raymond's treaty with Saladin and agreed with his new seneschal Cuillin that the Sultan's power must be checked. Once Baldwin assumed direct control, he and his advisors began planning an attack on Egypt. To launch his offensive against Egypt, Baldwin needed naval support. He therefore sent Reynald of Chatillon to Constantinople to negotiate the purchase of ships. Meanwhile, Baldwin contracted malaria from Sibylla's late husband William and was unable to lead a major military campaign without a deputy. When Reynald returned from Constantinople, the king entrusted him with governance and military command, a decision that offended Raymond III of Tripoli. Unfortunately, the hoped-for alliance with the Byzantine Empire for a naval assault on Egypt collapsed. Raymond III had attacked the Saracen fortress of Harim in northern Syria, followed by a large crusader force, the Hospitallers, and many Templars. This left the Kingdom of Jerusalem with few troops to defend its own lands. Saladin seized the opportunity, planning an invasion of the kingdom from Egypt. When informed of Raymond's northern campaign, he wasted no time. With an army of about 21,000 to 30,000 men, he marched into Jerusalem's territory. Learning of Saladin's plans, Baldwin left Jerusalem and rode to Ascalon with his Templars, entering the city without resistance. Saladin hesitated to attack, wary of the highly skilled Templar commanders, and instead left part of his force to besiege Gaza, stationed smaller detachments near Ascalon, and marched north with the rest of his army, believing Baldwin would not pursue him. But on November 25, 1177, Baldwin surprised Saladin near Ramla, where the Leper King led the Crusader army in the Battle of Montgisard. Legend often exaggerates, claiming Baldwin left Jerusalem with only 375 Templars. Some estimates, however, suggest as many as 500 knights and 4,000 infantry and archers took part in the battle. The Christian attack was sudden and devastating. The Templar heavy cavalry smashed through Saladin's rearguard, which was moving through a steep valley. Additional Crusader detachments soon arrived to support Baldwin, and a brutal fight raged until sunset. The king himself, gravely ill and with his hands bandaged, fought in the thick of battle. Gradually, confusion spread through Saladin's forces, and before they could regroup, the Templars cut them down with their swords. Despite Saladin's efforts to rally his men, it was in vain. Barely a tenth of his army survived. His personal guard of Mamluk warriors was annihilated while defending him. At the end of the fighting, Saladin mounted a swift camel and fled back to Egypt. Although Baldwin attempted to pursue him, he could not catch him. The victory at Montgisard was of great importance to the Crusaders. It demonstrated that even a small but well-led army could defeat a far larger enemy. For King Baldwin, the battle became one of the pinnacles of his reign, securing his place in history as one of the most courageous kings of the Crusades. Since Baldwin did not have enough men to pursue and attack Saladin's retreating army, he decided to fortify the Damascene frontier. Persuaded by the Templars, he built a castle called Chastelet on the upper reaches of the River Jordan. It was to serve as a bulwark against Muslim incursions into the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and as a fortress and protection for pilgrims and merchants traveling across Christian Palestine. Under pressure from local Muslims, Saladin offered Baldwin money in exchange for halting construction, but the King of Jerusalem refused. In 1179, Saladin again attacked the Crusader states from the direction of Damascus and sent Saracen raiders to plunder villages and crops near Sidon and the coastal regions. In response, Baldwin moved his army to the city of Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee, and together with the Templars led by Odo of Saint-Amand and a force from the county of Tripoli under Count Raymond III, they headed northeast, where they struck and easily defeated Saracen forces returning from their raids. Believing the fight against the Saracens won, the Crusaders relaxed their guard and were taken by surprise by Saladin's main army, which had been following them. The Crusader forces suffered a heavy defeat, and King Baldwin barely escaped thanks to his bodyguard, who helped him avoid capture. Because of his illness, the king could not mount a horse quickly, so a knight carried him to safety, hacking a path through the Saracens with Baldwin's guard. At the end of August, Saladin besieged Chastelet, and before Baldwin could react, the castle was taken. The Crusaders suffered yet another defeat. During Holy Week of 1180, Bohemond III of Antioch and Raymond III of Tripoli decided to march their armies into Jerusalem to force King Baldwin to marry his sister Sibylla to Baldwin of Ibelin and to make him abdicate. Although Baldwin IV, whose health was steadily worsening, truly wished to abdicate, he did not want conditions imposed upon him, nor did he approve of Baldwin of Ibelin as a suitable husband for his sister. He therefore acted swiftly. Before the armies reached Jerusalem, he arranged for Sibylla to marry the Poitevin knight Guy of Lusignan. The coup was thus thwarted, and Bohemond and Raymond had to accept political defeat. Even then, Baldwin could not retire from affairs of state, for rifts broke out at court between the Jerusalem barons and the Hospitallers on one side, and the aggressive, militantly Christian newcomers from Western Europe together with the Templars on the other. In light of these troubles, Baldwin proposed a 2-year truce with Saladin, who gladly accepted, as he wished to campaign in northern Syria and avoid fighting on 2 fronts. In October 1180, Baldwin then betrothed his 8-year-old half-sister Isabella to the adolescent Lord of Toron, Humphrey IV, to secure Guy's position and to prevent a potential alternative claimant to the throne. He then sent his uncle and chief minister Jocelyn to assure the Byzantine court that Jerusalem still required their protection. During Jocelyn's absence, from mid-1180 to mid-1181, the full burden of rule fell on the king, whose health continued to decline. In this period, he relied chiefly on his mother. Baldwin's truce with Saladin was due to expire in May 1182, but unfortunately, thanks to Reynold, who seized a merchant caravan traveling from Egypt to Damascus, it effectively collapsed in mid-1181. Outraged, Saladin seized Christian pilgrims in retaliation and sent word to Baldwin that he would release the captives when Reynold returned everything he had stolen. Reynold refused, and Saladin declared war on the helpless Baldwin. In 1182, Saladin launched a large-scale offensive at several points across the kingdom simultaneously. Baldwin recognized the provocation to divide his forces and decided that Beirut held the greatest strategic importance. Ignoring Saladin's southern thrust, the king moved his troops to Tyre, where he gained the assistance of the Italian maritime republics, who broke Saladin's naval blockade. Saladin lifted the siege of Beirut but refused to conclude a truce with Baldwin, so the king of Jerusalem, in the winter of 1182 to 1183, struck at Damascus and captured rich spoils. Saladin then withdrew, in part due to problems within his own realm. By 1183, Baldwin could no longer walk without support or use his hands, and because he was unable to blink, his corneas dried out and he went blind. Yet, with Saladin renewing his attacks on the Kingdom of Jerusalem and, after the capture of Aleppo, marching south, the king had to summon his army. When Baldwin developed a fever that threatened his life, he entrusted the government to his brother-in-law Guy, whom he appointed regent. Baldwin retained only the royal title and authority over the city of Jerusalem, and he made Guy swear that so long as Baldwin lived, Guy would not make himself king, nor alienate any part of the realm. However, Guy had no military experience. The barons and nobility, the independent rulers of Antioch and Tripoli, and the grand masters of the military orders refused to cooperate with him. When, in late 1183, the wedding of Baldwin's half-sister Isabella to Humphrey IV of Toron was being celebrated at Kerak, Saladin attacked the fortress during the festivities, hoping to capture the king's half-sister and her husband. Because Guy of Lusignan hesitated to relieve Kerak and failed to assemble the army, Baldwin immediately dismissed him from the regency. Such a vital stronghold, and the safety of the king's half-sister, could not be entrusted to a man who had proved unable to command. The disgraced Guy withdrew to Ascalon, which he governed. The king's mother then proposed that Sibylla's 5-year-old son, Baldwin V, be made co-king. The proposal was accepted, and the boy was crowned and anointed in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on November 20th, 1183. Baldwin then summoned all his vassals and, despite his helplessness and blindness, led his army to Kerak. When Saladin learned of Baldwin's advance, he abandoned the siege and withdrew to Egypt. Fearing that, after his death, Guy might seize the regency over his nephew's rule, Baldwin decided to annul Guy's marriage to Sibylla. He reportedly intended to claim that Guy had forced the king's sister into the match, thus rendering the union unlawful. Sibylla's unwavering loyalty to her husband, however, foiled the plan. The couple refused to appear before the court, where the marriage was to be annulled. At the beginning of 1184, Baldwin ordered Guy to come to Jerusalem, but Guy refused, citing poor health. The king then had himself carried to the city of Ascalon, accompanied by the high court, but Guy refused him entry. Baldwin was then welcomed at Jaffa, where he installed his own governor, thereby depriving Guy of half his county. In Acre, Baldwin convened his council, likely to secure support for seizing Guy's fief on the grounds of his refusal to heed a royal summons. The Patriarch and the Grand Masters pleaded with Baldwin to pardon Guy, hoping to avoid civil war. That, however, was unacceptable to Baldwin, as it would have been to any ruler. When the king learned that Saladin was again besieging Kerak, he marched with his army to the city's aid. Yet, as during the first siege, the Muslim host withdrew before the Crusader relief force could even arrive. At the end of 1184, Baldwin was shocked to learn of Guy's massacre of Bedouins from the royal fief of Dharam, Bedouins who were under royal protection and who had provided intelligence on Egyptian movements. Shortly afterward, the king of Jerusalem developed a fever. When he returned to Jerusalem at the end of 1184 or the beginning of 1185, Baldwin granted the regency to Raymond III of Tripoli, a man he had never trusted, but for whom he could find no better alternative. On his deathbed, Baldwin summoned the High Court and appointed Raymond as permanent regent for his nephew, Baldwin V. The dying king decreed that homage be paid to his nephew as king and to Raymond as regent. Baldwin IV of Jerusalem died in the presence of his vassals sometime between March and May 1185 at the age of 24. His death marked the end of one of the most significant chapters in the history of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. After his passing, the throne passed to his 8-year-old nephew, Baldwin V. The boy king, however, died the following year, and his mother Sibylla thus became the rightful heir to the throne. Raymond and his supporters wanted to install Sibylla's sister Isabella instead, but Sibylla would not be intimidated. She marched on Jerusalem with her army and occupied the city. Jerusalem was hers, but before her coronation, she was forced to promise her supporters and others that she would annul her marriage to Guy and quickly find another husband. Sibylla agreed to this demand, but only on the condition that she be allowed to choose her next husband herself. And so she did. She divorced Guy, but after her coronation, she married him once again, crowned him king, and outwitted them all. After the loss of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, Sibylla went to Saladin and pleaded for Guy's release, as he had been captured during the Battle of Hattin. Together they went to Tyre, and later, when Guy was besieging the fortress of Acre, Sibylla and her daughters, Alex and Maria, all died of an unspecified disease that spread through their camp. After Sibylla's death, the ruling Queen of Jerusalem became Isabella I, who reigned from 1190 until her death in 1205. And that is the end of the story of King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, who died young, his life and reign shaped by leprosy. Nevertheless, he demonstrated great personal strength and became a ruler who secured his place in history. What do you think of his story, and about whom would you like to hear more? Tell us in the comments.